Great.
So thanks again for the opportunity to, in this beautiful platform, I'm a really big fan of this anticipatory governance Slack, to be able to share my work that I've been working on for these last few years together with a few colleagues. My name is, as Sarah was saying, my name is Marieke Veeger. I'm a scenarios and policy researcher, and I work for the CGIAR research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security, CCAPS. For them, I coordinate the Future Scenarios project in Latin America. So together with Joost, I'm part of a global team where we work in different regions, basically accompanying different countries in creating future scenarios to guide and robust climate change policymaking. I'm based in San Jose, Costa Rica at the University of International Cooperation. And basically what I wanted to do today was share with you something that I've been working on together with my colleagues, especially with Carlijn Muiderman, on a regime shift that I feel that's necessary to be able to reach ambitious climate goals. So I really like the topic of social imaginaries, and I think I love that it's a broad theme that includes many different ways of exploring the future, looking both at more optimistic futures, but also taking into account other things that might happen. So that's basically what I wanted to discuss with you today. Okay, so you've probably heard about the nationally determined contributions. I'll be using this term a lot in this presentation. You perhaps remember this moment in Paris in 2015, where countries worldwide signed the Paris Agreement and committed themselves to reduce emissions to prevent serious catastrophic climate effects. And what basically these nationally determined contributions do is that it's an international commitment from countries to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. And every few years, each country is supposed to hand in another version of this NDC that basically shows that they're advancing in this goal, and also tells other countries how they're planning on keeping on doing that in the next few years. In 2020, there was a really big pressure from the international community for countries to hand in more enhanced NDCs. So NDCs, the idea is that these climate goals become more ambitious every few years. And in 2020, there was this really big pressure from the international communities to have more ambitious NDCs. And what we saw in the end, what we saw earlier on this year, when they started analyzing the NDCs, is that they're actually not ambitious enough. So what the synthesis report indicates is that it's basically the level of ambition is lower than is required, and countries must redouble their climate efforts if they are to achieve the Paris agreements, which would basically come down to that we need to be to have 45% lower carbon dioxide emissions in 2030 than in 2010. So this basically means that there still is a really big gap between the commitments that are made now and the commitments that we need to make. And what I would like to present and share with you today is that in my research for the last few years, I've been finding out that these prescribed mechanisms to develop NDCs and to plan for decarbonization and adaptation to climate change are basically outdated. They're untenable, and they do not enable the anticipation of this serious transformational change that is needed to be able to reduce the amount of emissions that we need. And what I've been looking at together with my colleague Carlijn Muiderman is that we've been looking into literature and connecting to this with transformative governance, arguing that by looking at the case of Costa Rica, we feel that a regime shift is taking place where governance actors have recognized that a change in approach is needed and have been also experimenting with new approaches to be able to set very ambitious climate goals. And they've basically been saying, okay, the way in which the international community says that we should define this goal is really doesn't work for us and is outdated, and we should really be looking into new methodologies. So we're researching this by looking at Costa Rica's NDC formulation processes and the institutional changes that have taken place to address these changes that are needed. So when we talk about regime shift, we're basically looking at this transformative environmental governance lens, which Chaffin in 2016 mentioned in his paper. So that's more or less the topic of my presentation today. So what's with this with these NDCs, and why are they important now when we're talking about climate action? Well, basically, these, as I was saying, NDCs are this pledge to the world where a country indicates how they will contribute in achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. So a country indicates how much emissions they will reduce, how they intend to adapt to climate change, and who will participate in that process. So which sectors are we focusing on? But I feel that NDCs are really not only about making a commitment, but they're also an opportunity every few years to really be able to catalyze change under all these different sectors and basically all these different people that have to change the way they're producing, living, working, and basically how a society works. So I basically feel that the process of developing NDCs should much more focus on imagining this societal change that is needed in a collective way where a lot of people participate. And what we see now is that these NDC processes are actually very technical, so very much focused on talking about what measures are needed to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. They're very much focused on numbers, because basically, which is logical because a country has to indicate how much emissions they want to reduce. But I feel that the process should be much more about imagining these changes that are needed. So when countries started to define these nationally determined contributions in 2015, it really wasn't that clear how that could be done. So different organizations related to UNFCCCs developed these guidelines to basically set up these NDCs. So when I started working with Costa Rica, I started looking into those guidelines to understand how the international community is actually prescribing countries to do this. So what I saw is that the guidelines are very much focused on quantitative emission abatement calculations of current policies that a country has to reduce emissions. They also mention that they recommend a participatory dialogue process, basically to gain support from all these different stakeholders that will have to implement the NDC and reduce emissions. And that was in 2015. So then in 2019, new guidelines came out to enhance their NDCs in 2020. So I was really curious to look into those guidelines. So basically really trying to figure out what's new, what are they suggesting to really increase in ambition? And what I saw is that actually not that much is new. There were very logical things that were in those guides. So basically they mentioned, okay, you should consider all the different innovations that we have now and the new data that we have about how we can reduce emissions. So basically, again, looking at all these different technologies and measures that are needed and calculate with different models to understand how much emissions you can reduce in that way. They also indicate that countries should take stock of recent developments. So again, updated greenhouse gas inventories, different trends in key sector indicators. So key indicators for each sector that show if they're advancing in emission reduction. They indicate that they should also take into account new technologies, and also if countries have new policies or new strategies to reduce emissions. Well, that all very much makes sense, right? Because it's basically updating an NDC. And in that same sense, they also indicate that they should take into account the synergies and co-benefits between different sectors. So up until there, that's all fine, and that makes sense. That's the way it should be. The thing is that based on this experience that I had working together with Costa Rica, we really had the feeling that that really wasn't enough. So what we feel is missing in this current dominant way of indicating countries how they should define these emission reduction goals is that they're very much focused on quantitative ways of calculating how much emissions can be reduced, right? So we need quantitative modeling to calculate how many emissions can be reduced, because an NDC basically asks for these numbers. The thing is that modeling is always a reduced version of reality, and we should wonder, and we should ask ourselves if it really considers the complexity of local problematics, right? And I think the major point here is that if we want to really drastically reduce emissions, we need transformations to be able to avoid these climate-related catastrophes. And to be able to anticipate these transformations, you can't just extrapolate data of the past, right? So what you see here, this little figure that I showed, is basically Costa Rica in 2015 trying to do that, right? So they were very ambitious in the climate goal that they wanted to set, and when they worked with modelers in the way that's internationally prescribed, these model results didn't come up with what they really wanted to do. So these model results, basically they wanted their emissions really to go down, and what they were seeing in these figures is that they basically what they were able to do is make the emissions sort of like go down a bit, but then they would stabilize again. And the Costa Rican NDC team was like, but really we really want them to go down. So how can we do that without in a different way, right? Something has to change here. So what I want to say here is that these guidelines really do not show countries how to reduce these emissions, but also I think something that's really key in this whole discussion where countries have to feel safe and have the confidence to commit to something in a world where they feel that there's very much uncertainty on how they can actually achieve that. Because the world is a very connected place. Everything is changing all the time. We have a lot of uncertainties. So I feel that countries also have to learn how to deal with this uncertainty. And they also have to learn how to imagine how these transformations can take place. Okay, so another thing that we've been looking at is that there are quite some issues with this focus on quantitative modeling of greenhouse gas emissions. Again, I think it's necessary, or at least at the moment, it's necessary that some sort of modeling is done, because in an NDC, basically a country has to state how much emissions they want to reduce. So you need a model to come up with those numbers. But the thing is that countries that are in development do not necessarily have the same capacities as other countries to run these models. Um, Also, these countries do not necessarily have the same conditions to be able to work with these different models. So data, the availability of data can be an issue in the sense that all these different institutions have to be collecting this data, and that doesn't necessarily happen. Uh, then in the second place, we also see an issue with the access to that data. So in developing countries, we very much see a situation where different organizations not necessarily want to share the data that they have available. So they're very much secretive to that data, in really literally indicating that we're paying for this data to be uh, obtained. So if you want that data, you'll have to pay for it as well. Fortunately, that's something that's changing over time, but it still is an issue. And then the third issue is this issue related to trust, which I basically just mentioned, that um, when data is available, there's not necessarily a trust in the quality of this data due to many other different factors. And so these different criteria or observations that I'm mentioning to you is result of research that we've been doing in Central America within the Reimagine project, which is a sister project of CCAFs that we're working for, basically where we've been interviewing and talking to different institutions in Central America, both public, private, and of research organizations and universities, where we've been talking to them about the anticipation of futures and what capacities they have for that, what challenges they encounter, and what opportunities they have. And a third thing that they mention is that it's quite a challenge to collaborate between different institutions. So if there is data, then it's quite a challenge to be able to combine all that data and looking at relations between this data and really being able to understand what's happening. So we have an issue with that countries in development do not necessarily have the same capacities. They do not necessarily have the same conditions to run these models. And the collaboration that's needed between institutions to really together as a country work on emission reduction is also something that still has to be has its challenges. Okay, I see there's a question. I can answer it now, or we can leave the questions for later. Sarah, how are we working with that?
That's completely up to you. If you want to address the questions in the chat as you go, that's fine. Or you can do a session at the end to answer all the questions. But I think most presenters so far have just like answered the questions in the chat when they came up.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so Nicholas is mentioning, I'm very interested in the multiple and complex roles that numbers play in decision making. Quantification is also a way of building up legitimacy, justifying actions. Well, that wasn't okay. Yeah, true. Yeah, let's see. So what at least what I see often is that numbers are used as a way to legitimize a process. And stakeholders very much feel that they need these numbers, that when you work with models, something is more scientifically correct. But you do mention a point that numbers are indeed needed to, for example, in NDCs, numbers are really important because they can show how much you're really advancing, right? We have this whole monitoring and evaluation aspect that's very important in NDCs. So yes, I agree, but there's also a catch to it. Okay. So what I feel from this process in Costa Rica, where I'll be showing you the 3 different moments in time where they've been bumping into these issues, and I'll also be showing you how they've addressed them, is that social imaginaries and the anticipation of multiple futures and imagination of futures is really a necessary innovation to set these NDC and climate goals, but also to achieve them. So I really feel that we need to imagine how these major transformations that we need could take place, and also what could basically make or break that these major changes in society take place. So there we have so many beautiful examples now of these anticipatory practices and how they can take place. I just mentioned a few here on the screen. The thing is that they're not that much applied yet to these NDC processes. I feel that the NDC processes are still very much focused on technical thinking about technical ways of reducing the emissions, and not that much about imagining how a society can change and what might happen to inhibit that from happening, and how we might avoid that. So basically, in that way, we can anticipate future uncertainties, but we can also test what are our most vulnerable assumptions, and we can also define backup plans. So as a country, we're planning to reduce emissions in this way and adapt to climate change in this way. But what if other things might happen, and what would we do in that case? Right? I feel that thinking about these goals and setting these goals is also um, that's also part of the process. And the second really important aspect is that we should really move from a focus that's totally concentrated on the small groups of experts that think about this, towards more collective processes where different stakeholders in society think about these possible futures. Also, think about these climate actions, and will they really work for us? Are they ambitious enough? What other things can we do? And how do we imagine how this might happen? And what if these different measures that we have in mind don't work out simply because people don't want to change, or the conditions in our country are not well set yet to be able to achieve those goals? So we really need to start imagining these possible futures. And what I feel is that when we do that in a collective way, together with all these different stakeholders, is that it can really set in motion this climate action that we so much need now. So an NDC process cannot only be about setting goals; it really has to be about taking action, right? And so um, one way in which you could do that is basically looking at all these different seed initiatives that are taking place on a small scale, and imagining how you could bring them to a higher level within a country. And then obviously also looking at, okay, if we're trying to do that, then what can go wrong, and what can we do to address that? But also something that I feel is really important is this: when we have these different, for example, scenarios exercises where all these different types of stakeholders are together, um, you also really see that they talk to each other and imagine these different futures. So in CCAFs and in the processes that we organize, we always put together stakeholders, um, not only from different sectors. So for example, from the agriculture sector with the transport and energy sector in my processes, where I've been focusing more on environmental change and not only agriculture. But we also want stakeholders to talk together that are from the government and from the private sector, or that somebody from academia sits next to somebody from the private sector, because between these people, they really cross-pollinate ideas, right? And in different processes, I've always also seen that um, if you have stakeholders that are doing very innovative stuff, really changing the way that the business as usual way of producing, for example, and if you set them together with a very conservative sector, or that's producing in a more conservative ways, I don't know, for example, in Costa Rica, we still have other sectors that are still polluting a lot. and such as the pineapple or the banana industry. But you also see stakeholders within those same sectors that are doing amazing things to reduce emissions and to adapt to climate change. So what I feel is important is to put these stakeholders together to talk about these possible futures, because when they talk about the future, they also talk a lot about things that are wrong now and that should change. Okay, so this, my second point is that we need to move from this focus on only working together in small groups of experts towards more collective processes where we anticipate and imagine the future. Okay, I'm just looking at my time. That I'd really like to keep some time for questions and comments. So I'd like to give you a few examples from Costa Rica, which have basically been inspiring this our way of thinking about this regime shift that's needed. So in 2015, which is the moment where countries had to hand in their intended nationally determined contribution, the first time that countries were thinking about setting these climate goals, they found a lot of limitations during that process. I mentioned it earlier a bit. They really did their best to determine this NDC in the way that was internationally described and prescribed for them. So they had a really good modeling team that was making these different abatement strategies and modeling these abatement strategies for them. But they encountered several limitations. So they found that the data that they needed to run these models in the way that they found that was most complete or most correct was actually incomplete. There was also very much a discussion about the quality of data about the amount of emissions that forests can absorb, but just simply because science had been evolving, and they found out that basically the most primary forests weren't able to absorb as much emissions as earlier science was indicating. So there was a lot of discussion about data, and they were worried that this discussion about data would create issues within this whole NDC process. Also, they felt that while working with this modeling team, there wasn't enough transparency about the assumptions that they used to model these strategies and the different formulas that they were using. Oh, whoops. This will go on off again, so I'll turn that off in a bit. So they were worried about, they had the feeling that there wasn't enough transparency about these assumptions that were used, but also and mainly the criteria that were established by the modelers to run these models did not enable the exploration of all these transformational scenarios that they actually had in mind. So for these modelers, the measures that they would model had to be technically viable. So the technology to be able to reduce emissions had to be available, which when when you're looking at 2050 or 2030, those technologies are not necessarily available yet. They also had to fit within the existing policies that the country had at that moment, which again, if you really want to transform a society, those policies are not necessarily there yet. And also another criteria that the modelers used was that the information on the costs and techniques of the measures had to be available, because otherwise they weren't able to run the model. So basically this NDC team, they were running into all these different issues, and they wanted to look for an alternative. So this is when they came to us, and they asked if they could collaborate with us to basically in a collective way, together with different stakeholders that really think and work in climate change in Costa Rica, imagine possible futures that are relevant for climate change and environmental change in Costa Rica. So the reason why they came to us was very simple, and it's because 2 years earlier, one of the people that was the person that was leading this NDC process had collaborated with us to create regional scenarios for Central America about agriculture, environments, and livelihoods. And this person remembered the methodology and that it was really a way of uh, bringing together different stakeholders and talking about the future. So what we did was, basically bring these people together to imagine these possible futures and talk about emission reduction. So we use this participatory scenarios approach to discuss the climate measures that the country had in mind. People suggested new climate measures. They then downscaled regional scenarios for Central America to a national level, making sure that they would talk about issues that were relevant for the country, but also relevant to these different climate policies, and basically tested these climate measures in these multiple future scenarios, and then robusted the climate measures, taking into account what might happen. They didn't only use this participatory approach, they also still stuck to the modeling of their abatement strategies. But something else that they did was that they basically decided, okay, how much emissions do we want to reduce? This desired volume of emissions that we want to have in 2050, and backcasted from that desired amount to the present to be able to define how much emission or tons per capita had to be reduced every year, taking into account population change, etc. And so what happened here is that they were basically able to lower this curve, as you might have remembered that I showed you earlier, that these models weren't able to lower. And what happened basically is that this process enabled them to take what they call a leap of faith. So the models were able to show, with the current information that we have on the current technologies available, we are able to reduce this amount of emissions. But we know that we want to go a step further, and this process has given us the confidence that stakeholders are determined to also collaborate in that. So we're going to go a step further. Although we don't necessarily know yet how we're going to do that, because that information is not available yet. Okay. I would love to go more into this, but we don't have time for that. So I'll just move on. So really just quickly, in 2017, we collaborated again. 2017 was a moment in which they really wanted to define institutional agreements between different ministries, the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Environment, to support the private sector in achieving this transformation. So instead of just signing an agreement, they invited again all these different stakeholders from these sectors to, and mainly focusing on the agro-food sector and livestock sector, to generate a long-term vision, envisioning literally this transformation. And then again, also looking at different scenarios that might inhibit that from happening or that might enable that from happening. So this was again a very participatory process, and not only signing an agreement, but really together with stakeholders envisioning how this might happen. Okay. And last year in 2020, this NDC team went even a step further. From the beginning in 2015, they decided that they really wanted to enhance their capacities in anticipating the future. So they have been setting in motion different institutional changes, mainly investing in a team at the University of Costa Rica, where they're able to model all these different scenarios, modeling mainly the costs and benefits of decarbonization, together with different partners that supported them, and then mainly the International Development Bank. The Inter-American Development Bank, sorry. And they complemented that very much number-focused process on a participatory with a participatory scenario development process. So we were in the middle of the pandemic, so this entire process took place virtually. More than 350 people participated. We had something like I think it was 22 workshops, and basically what happened in this process is that all these different stakeholders thought about things, contextual changes that could take place on a national level, on a regional level, and on a global level that could challenge the reaching of these climate goals. They created multiple future scenarios, and then they anticipated what those scenarios would actually mean for each of the different sectors that has to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. So we worked together with the transport sector, together with the agriculture sector, together with the energy sector, waste management, and also a sector more focused on territorial development. So basically, again, this was a process where we were able to do more things. They already had a team that was being capacitated in doing this modeling work, but they also had a team that was being capacitated in doing this more, facilitating this more participatory process to anticipate and imagine futures. Okay, so this is where I start summarizing and closing up. Basically, what we're trying to show with this research is that it's necessary to have a regime shift on an international level. Social imaginaries are a necessary alternative for countries with different capacities and conditions to define climate goals, and also contingency plans to back up their current plans to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. They can also help imagine how transformative development could take place that's in line with this 1.5 degree climate goal. Social imaginaries can also help countries deal with uncertainties and basically give them more confidence to set ambitious climate goals. And they can also set in motion the climate action that is needed if they're able to involve many different stakeholders in this process. Okay, of course, there are also some pitfalls and challenges in doing this. I think one of the main ones is that, likewise with modeling, not all countries have the capacity to collectively anticipate futures. And what we've seen in CGAFs in our research program is that this is really a process that where stakeholders learn how to anticipate futures, and this is something that will take time. But we have also seen that it's possible. I think something we, at least at the moment, we still see that these processes should go hand in hand with quantitative approaches, although I think that's also something that can be discussed. But basically, since NDCs are meant to set goals, countries also need to be able to show how they will how much emissions they will really reduce in this process. So that's where I think modeling is just inevitable. But also, you can also wonder, you can always have you can have a participatory process, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the people who need to participate also participate. So who decides who will be involved in that process, right? We always want to at least intend to do that in the best inclusive way possible. And also, when you involve stakeholders, there are many pros and cons related to different approaches. So last year, the NDC team in Costa Rica had a very inclusive process where a lot of different stakeholders were able to participate in this anticipatory process. Participate in this process. But doing a process online also has disadvantages, and there are certain groups that are not able to participate that way, right? Such as elderly people or indigenous groups. So you have to make sure that they can participate and have their say in different moments in that process. Whereas if you have a physical process where you have workshops, there are less people that can participate. So just to mention a few pitfalls and challenges in that process. Okay. I hope we still have time for questions. That's really what I'm mainly interested in. So something just perhaps to give a few ideas. I'm really interested in understanding if this if what you're hearing now makes sense. If perhaps some people here that have also seen similar processes in other countries. Yeah, just I really much like to hear what your thoughts are on this and your if you've been seeing similar things.
Marieke, just to say, we have a small buffer because technically we have a break planned now for from 2:40 until 3. So I think you can definitely have a Q&A during the break. Just saying, if anyone wants to take a break, feel free to do that. We just have to move on at 3.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. So we have about 10-15 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, is there anyone that would like to say something about related to this process or any thoughts on this?
Maybe I can start. I actually have a question because I also read about Costa Rica that you have, I think, about almost 100% renewable energy. So I'm also wondering to what extent this country already has maybe quite a large capacity or like drive to facilitate these processes and really transform and move towards maybe a more sustainable system. Can you identify any of this in the processes that you've been involved with? And do you feel like there's just also a larger willingness which actually enables all these processes, which might be missing in other contexts? And because I've learned a bit about participatory processes and have also often encountered that it can be a process that is not necessarily empowering for stakeholders, but more you doing this participatory process so that you seem like you're inclusive and involving a lot of people, but in the end just use it to legitimize what you're actually planning to do. But this seems like a very different dynamic, and just wanted to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, okay. Interesting questions and comments, Sarah. Let's see. Yes, I do think that Costa Rica has an advantage compared to other countries because they have a long history in sort of like setting the stage to be able to reduce emissions and mainly focused on conservation in at least in history. And yes, they also have an advantage that their energy matrix is already very much based on renewables. The thing is that I think similar to other countries, they also have a lot of challenges. So Costa Rica is based in Central America, which is most of the one of the regions most vulnerable to climate change. Their energy matrix at the moment is mainly based on hydroelectrics, which, considering future changes in climate, is quite vulnerable. So they realized that a few years ago, and they've started to diversify their renewable energies. And also, there are a few sectors that are still quite vulnerable. So within the emission matrix of Costa Rica, mainly transport and also agriculture and livestock are the main emitters. So, and in both these sectors, major changes are needed that are basically focused on big changes that have to take place. That producers have to start producing in a different way, that people have to move themselves in a different way. So anyone that's been to Costa Rica has seen that it's a beautiful country and that we have a lot of nature and conservation, but that we also have a serious traffic issue mainly in the central metropolitan area, because it's a middle income country, and the main ideal is still that is to have a car and to move yourself in that way, and also because the public transport is not organized that well yet. So I feel that it's a country that already has major advantages, but it's also a country that has a lot of challenges to face. Yeah. Um, and in terms of legitimacy, that's a really good question, because yes, that is something that we see. But I think here the most important sort of trigger is the motivation that's behind the process. So defining an NDC is not only a checklist. They say that we have to have a participatory process, but I think it's mainly understanding that if we really want these major changes to take place, then we need to involve the people that have to go through that process. And when they imagine how that can happen, and they imagine what can go seriously wrong, I think that they start to understand that these changes have to take place, and that they're either on the boat or are not. So yeah, I think that in Costa Rica we really see this intrinsical motivation of we want these people on board, so we want to have them participate right from the beginning. We can't just decide how things will happen, because they're the ones that will have to do it. And as a government, we can support them in that process. But they're the ones that will have to change.
Thank you. I think Miranda had her hand up, but maybe she lowered it again. And now
Yeah,
I
see that Miranda placed the question. Thanks a lot, Miranda. So Miranda mentioned, I would be interested in how the modelers reacted to the alternative NDC scenarios. It is often the case that models limit what climate policy responses are thought of as possible or feasible based on what can be modeled. As is very hard to model society change, I would expect modelers to not deem them feasible or realistic. Were they involved in the participatory processes as well? Interested in hearing. Yeah, good question, Miranda. Yeah, they were actually involved in the process. And I think the NDC team was uh, was very much thinking about how to handle this situation. And I think they did it in a very good way. They also understood that they needed these model results in this process. So they basically, what they did was manage both processes at the same time and have them complement each other. And I think that what we saw in this process, and what I've also seen in other workshops, in these scenario workshops, is that it's really a conversation, right? The question about which scenarios are feasible or plausible always comes up, and yeah, they're not. We don't necessarily know how feasible or plausible or realistic they are, but we should take them into account, right? So it's really a conversation between these two fronts. I hope that helps, Miranda.
Can you see the raised hands, Marieke?
Oh, no, I cannot. Sorry, I'll stop sharing my screen. Yes. Let's see. Carolina? Adelante.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Marieke, for your very nice presentation. And I'm very pleased to hear how you're doing in Costa Rica. And I was also wondering, how have you managed to get this role from academia? But I see that you have been acting rather as a facilitator and not as, with this prescriptive role that is usually attached to academia, that policymakers and stakeholders many times expect that when they see that someone from a prestigious university is coming, like, okay, now he or she is going to tell us what we have to do, and that's good, So yeah, so I would very much like to hear how this process has been, and also for yourself, because I also believe, I'm sure it's not the case in this group, but for many people working in academia and universities, well, it's there's this bias, like I have to tell them what it's they need me to say this, and otherwise perhaps I'm not such a good scientist. So yeah, I'd like to hear this.
Oh, I love this question, Carolina. Thanks a lot. I think my the way that I work is very much a result of my work with CCAPs, because we can never just indicate how things have to be done. The first thing that we always do is listen to our clients. So if a country comes to us with a request, the first thing that we do is listen, right? So where are your needs? What's challenging to you, and how can we support you? And CCAPS has a lot of different ways that they can collaborate with a country, many different tools. And when we hear that they would like to use a scenarios approach, that's when we come in. And then again, we listen to what is it that we need, that they need, and how can we design that process in a way that responds to their needs. I think that maybe if in the first place a stakeholder or a client has that impression that we're the ones with the knowledge, then that impression is very quickly taken away by simply showing that we're interested in designing a process that's useful to them. Yeah. Also always taking into account what we learn in science, and our work is very much applied science, but yeah, we're definitely not the experts. No.
Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. Hey, Caroline is here as well. Okay.
I have a question. Can I? You hear me? Yeah. I was wondering, were you also approached by other countries? Like, oh yeah, it looks like, because you also made like a handbook for such participatory scenario making, and were you like were you asked for like advices from the government, or like but maybe the governments are not interested, but the civil society is interested and they want to persuade their government? Because I can see that like Costa Rica can do everything good, but still it's like if the global north like this is still relying on modeling and everything, because as you said, many countries in global north does have enough data, and maybe they're not inclined to do such imaginaries. I mean, in academic and civil society definitely, but maybe the government officers are not super inclined. Then yeah, how do you persuade them? And also, were you approached by them or other countries?
Okay. Yes, we've worked together with many different countries. My colleagues in different regions, and yes, I've also worked together with many different countries in Latin America. I don't know. We started collaborating with Honduras back in 2014. We worked on a regional strategy for Central America and the SICA region. We collaborated with Colombia, with Peru, different countries in the Andes region. And I think that, let's see, in terms of if they're willing to do a process like this, I think what we see often is that there are a few really, pioneers that feel that something has to be done differently. And something that's key is that they're able to convince decision makers that that's the methodology, or that's the way to go. Because yeah, I mean, if people that make a decision about this process are not on board, then it's really not, there's no point of doing a participatory process, right? Because you want to prevent that this is just a legitimization of doing a process and really make sure that they want this to be done this way. So for example, in Honduras, the first process that we had, which Joost was there as well, was so cool. It was really a very simple process where we had a regional workshop in a regional office of the Ministry of Agriculture. Simple in a sense that it really didn't cost a lot of money to do that process, but the government was very much interested in having representatives of small-scale farmer organizations to think about the policy, the climate smart agriculture, the food security and climate change policy that they were developing. So they wanted them to look at that policy critically, and they also were aware that it was relevant to take into account all these future uncertainties. So we did that process to get in one of the most regional vulnerable regions in Honduras, together with universities, students, but also NGO representatives and people from the government. And if I recall well, about 2 or 3 weeks after we had that scenario workshop, we handed in the recommendations that the participants had written up. They then had several meetings with this sort of like governmental committee that looked at these recommendations, and several of major recommendations to the policy were included. And then it was about 1 year later that the policy was actually 1.5 years later that the policy was then approved. So these processes can take time. But if the people behind it are very much convinced that it should be done like that, then yeah, I think they are very legitimate.
There would maybe be time for one more question. But if there are no more questions, then I will thank you. Singhe?
Louise has a small question.
Louise, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, maybe
there you
it's too long and we can connect by email or something on where people might need to run off. But it was just to do with if there was a way that you tried to deal with like power dynamics, or did power dynamics come up in the processes of the workshops you were running as to who was talking more, who was talking less, who was maybe listened to, and stuff like that, and if you had any ways of navigating that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. I think power dynamics are always an issue in any workshop, right? You want to make sure that everybody has a voice. And in scenario, especially in scenario workshop, we often have big discussions about, no, this will never happen, and others, well, I think it might be possible. And what we do is that we work together with facilitators before the workshop. Sometimes people that have never facilitated a scenario workshop, but mostly people that have, to give them tips on what they can do when that happens, right? So we always work in small groups, and there's always a facilitator at the table. So indicating that you want to make sure that more quiet people can also participate, and we have different methods to make sure that it's not only verbal but also written, for example, and also a facilitator that can help out when somebody feels less comfortable in talking or writing. I think it's something that's always there, and we try to work with it. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Louise.
Great. Yeah, then I think we will have to move to the next presentation with Pat, who is also already present. And thanks, Marieke, for your presentation. It was really great to hear your experience on how to integrate social imaginaries in the processes that you've been part of in Costa Rica.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It was really my pleasure. Good questions. Thanks a lot.
Of course.